Hello everyone. I'm Dr. Sarah Moller and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the University of York and the Air Pollution Theme Leader for the National Centre for Atmospheric Science. And I'm also a co-investigator on this project. I'd like to welcome you all to the final event of the Systemic Environmental Risk Analysis for Threats to UK Recovery from COVID-19 project, or SysRisk project as it's come to be known. It's good to have participants here from a range of stakeholders, but it's also good, I've noticed, that we've got some representation of case study participants too who've contributed throughout the project. The way this meeting is going to run today is that we're going to start with a presentation of the project reflections, the recommendations, and that's going to be given by our project principal investigator, Tom Oliver, who I hope will introduce himself at the beginning. And then we'll have some brief comments from Phil Tovey, who's the Defra Futures lead. And that should last probably around 35 minutes. And then we'll have the rest of the time for discussions and questions. If you've got questions, please just add them in the chat as we go along. And I'll pick those up once we get to the discussion part. The SysRisk team, who you'll be introduced to in Tom's slides, will act as a kind of panel for this. And I'll try to direct your questions to the most appropriate team member. If your question you feel is directed specifically to someone, then if you note that when you put the question down, I can make sure that you get their input on it. And I guess without anything further, I will pass over to Tom to give you the presentation on the final report.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And thanks to everyone for coming. I'm aware it's a hectic week at the end of the year. And just to remind people that the slides are being recorded and the presentation will be made available on the web pages as well. So anyone who's listening remotely, welcome to the final report event. And I'm going to talk you through some of the key reflections from the report collated by the team. So many of you will be aware of this work by Will Stephan and colleagues called the Great Acceleration, that they call it, in terms of how these a number of trends accelerating over the last 50 years. So socioeconomic trends such as urban population size, energy use, water use, showing rapid increases over recent years. And of course, these trends interact and compound to lead to changes in Earth system trends, such as the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, driving climate change, tropical forest loss, and biodiversity degradation. Shown on this slide, these different socio-economic drivers are shown here in these interacting cogs. These are from the clusters of change identified by the European Environment Agency. And these interacting drivers lead to increasing risks, environmental systemic risks. So you can see here a number of different types of risks documented. And in some cases, these are relatively neglected in our discourse and our policies and regulations. Yet they have market impacts on health, on opportunities for future generations, on food security. And this project is about trying to think about these risks and develop processes for better understanding them and reducing those risks. So just in terms of definitions, we're familiar with more sort of conventional risks that have, we can estimate in probabilistic terms. So they occur in repeatable familiar patterns, and therefore we can use probabilistic estimates to predict where those risks will occur and use standard management practices to reduce those risks. So we've had great success in these areas, for example, workplace accidents, trying to understand where these accidents are likely to occur and put in place measures to reduce them. But there are other types of risks, and this is from the International Risk Governance Council, some definitions here, talking about emerging risks. And these are new risks that are becoming known. So changes in our socio-environmental systems are leading to the emergence of new types of risks. So that might be, the spread of diseases with climate change. And some of these emerging risks can also be systemic risks. And these are risks that cascade in quite complex ways through through our socio-environmental systems. And in some cases, these can lead to rapid changes in state and have impacts on our health and livelihoods. So just to come on to some more definitions, there's no single agreed definition of systemic risk. Here are a few from the literature. You can see the first one focuses on this idea of contagion effects across systems. The second definition focuses here on the probability of breakdown of the entire system. We discussed this definition and we weren't so keen on it because it's very unusual for the whole system to break down. What would entire system breakdown look like? And actually, of course, you can have impacts on health and livelihood before an entire system collapses. And the third definition talks about what are known as regime shifts. So these rapid tipping points in a system. So the system might be losing resilience below the bonnet. We don't really notice that, but then we get a sudden change in state. And that change in state could lead to one which has detrimental impacts on society. But again, we can have negative impacts through complex risk that still occur in a more gradual way. They don't always have to involve these tipping points. So the working definition we use in the project is really building from the first definition and encompassing numbers 2 and 3, but not restricted to being, the breakdown of the entire system or involving tipping points. So it's really a broader, more inclusive definition, focusing on complex risks that manifest through interactions in these different systems. So they're kind of unexpected or non-intuitive risks, and they occur through this process of contagion across these different, political, economic, social, technological spheres. So there's been a lot of work on systemic risks and complex risks, and we're trying to build on many of the different science policy initiatives that have been developed in this space. So there's just a few examples here, and actually in the report that we'll share and is on the project website, the SysRisk project website, there's a whole set of further reading detailing many of these useful reports. A lot of these reports highlight the importance of systemic risk and outline the need for institutional capacity to deal with it, but actually don't go into the exact processes by which you might appraise those different types of risk. So really that's the focus of our project, is to develop, is to pilot a new approach, thinking about can we identify previously neglected types of threats? How can we assess the likelihood and impact of different risk cascades? So these are different pathways of risk as they flow through those social environmental systems. Can we identify intervention points to reduce risk proactively? Or if we're going to put in place actions reactively, can we identify watch points? So these are data or monitoring initiatives whereby we can track the system dynamics and then put in place interventions adaptively as we need to. And also the overall aim of the project really is raising the profile of the need to appraise and mitigate these types of risks, especially environmental risks in the context of rebuilding after COVID-19. So the project was funded by the UK Research Councils under this COVID-19 urgency grant about rebuilding the nation after COVID-19. And really environmental risks, even though they feature strongly in COVID itself, obviously, and some of the other aspects surrounding COVID, they're actually underappreciated in some quarters. So really this is raising the profile of those types of risks. We're fortunate to really be able to bring together a broad interdisciplinary team on this project, and it was a real pleasure and honour to work with some of these people. So we've got myself, I'm based at the University of Reading, and my background is in applied ecology and socio-environmental systems. And then we have Professor Ian Jones and Dr. Matt Greenwell, who are also at the University of Reading, and they working on the biosecurity case study. Then we've got Professor Bob Doherty and Laura Harrison at the University of York, working on food security, joined by Andre Dornelis as well at York. And then on air quality, we have Ali Lewis, Sarah Moller, Shona Wild, and Amber Yeoman, all based at the University of York. And then we have Nigel Gilbert and Kelly Bozeman, who are working on the participatory systems mapping and project coordination. So yeah, it's been great to work in such a broad team, and you know, we face challenges in terms of getting everything together. Really, you know, we faced staff illnesses, from dental problems to COVID to gastric illness. I mean, it's probably good that, that this meeting is online, because I think the SysRisk team is a biosecurity risk in itself. But we're all recovered now, and actually we've managed to pull everything together, and the report will be sent around later today. And I hope you find it worthwhile. But it really, I've been so impressed with the motivation and the breadth of expertise on the team, and it's been an honour to work with everyone. Sorry, I should have missed out as well. It's covered partly by my Zoom window, but we're also fortunate to involve two colleagues from Defra, so Vanessa Pilley and Phil Tovey, who are working respectively on catastrophic risk and futures in Defra more generally. And they've been really engaged on the project, and it's been great to get their inputs as well. So I'm going to go into the processes of the project, and really we're taking a kind of self-critical approach in terms of, this is an experimental process, and we reflected on our limitations and constraints, and think about ways to refine the process. But really, I'm just going to give you the overall recommendation that to appraise systemic environmental risk, we're recommending a broad qualitative participatory systems mapping approach. And I'll come on to what that means in a moment. And that would involve inputs from a diverse range of experts to identify interventions, and then a follow-up process using systems approaches to assist with how those interventions are prioritised. And I'll flesh that out as I talk through the process and reflections. So just to remind you, it's qualitatively participatory systems mapping, and we're focusing on 3 case studies, and these were selected because they're particularly salient in the context of rebuilding after COVID-19. So we've got biosecurity itself, you know, improving resilience to zoonotic diseases like COVID. We've got air quality, which obviously air quality leads to over 100,000 deaths per year in the UK alone from air pollution, but also it can interact with COVID, reducing respiratory health and increasing mobility. There's some evidence of that. And food security has become more salient in the context of COVID-19 with supply chain disruptions, and is of course a longer term issue with climate change and land use degradation. So although these risks play out over longer time periods as well, they are also short term, you know, having impacts already. So we hope they're particularly salient for those less focused on environmental systems. The process involved this set of 7 participatory workshops. So 1 initial inception meeting, and then we split into these 3 streams by case study. And we had a set of workshops around identifying risk cascades, which I'll explain in a moment. And then a sort of deep dive into the types of interventions we can put in place. And then we had a final synthesis workshop as well. So we're fortunate to work with a large number of external experts as well, who are really amazing actually in terms of how they inputted and engaged on the project. So we took an approach to select experts in a stratified way, because we wanted to cover the breadth of expertise needed really to best try to understand these risks. We're never going to be comprehensive, but at least we can make sure we're trying to cover the many different aspects that we need to think about to deal with complex risks. This is the sort of broad elements of a systems approach, one way to kind of visualize what we mean by a systems approach. You know, we have different systems here, like environmental systems, social policy systems. Crucially, you know, people understand and understand those systems in different ways, have different perspectives. And equally, you know, involving multiple stakeholders and understanding those systems is important, and thinking at different spatial scales and across different timescales, and thinking how those systems deliver multiple outcomes that are beneficial for society. So whether that's the Sustainable Development Goals, or whether it's our 25-year environment plan or national infrastructure strategies, etc. but these multiple objectives that we hope to secure from these systems and maintain their resilience over the longer term. So with that in mind, we took this PESTLE acronym, political, economic, societal, technological, legal, environmental, which outlines these broad systems or spheres that we're trying to make sure we cover expertise in those areas. So you can see a number of example disciplines here that would fall under these topics. And what we did is we tried to seek out experts in those different areas. So you can see on this radar plot, we scored in the SysRisk team by looking at the web pages, research profiles of our experts, and tried to score their percentage expertise in different areas. And you can see that spread across the 3 case studies here. You know, we've done okay, and arguably probably better than if we'd have just taken a random approach to this, or if we'd have allowed people to approach us with interest in the project, and maybe we would have had a predominance of certain areas. But actually, you know, in some areas, for example, for air quality, the red line, we're a bit lacking perhaps on the legal expertise and technological economic expertise, whereas a good representation of environmental expertise. The other way to think about assessing expertise is for participants to score their expertise themselves, which arguably might be more accurate than us looking at a staff research profile. And we explored that process as well. So you've got the team assessment, our team external assessment in black, and the participant self-assessment in red. And this is just for the air quality case study shown as an example. So there's not, you know, they overlap reasonably, which is promising. But there's some areas of discrepancy. For example, we perhaps overestimated the level of political expertise in the air quality case study compared to a participant self-assessment. And so it may be that it's better to allow participants to self-assess. Obviously, there's some issues in terms of the lead-in time for any kind of project involving getting your participants lined up. So what we perhaps recommend is that you have an initial filtering approach where whoever's setting up the systemic risk project tries to gather as much broad expertise as possible using this assessment from web pages and staff profiles. But then you have a secondary process where you do self-assessment. And if there are gaps, you can have a second round of participant selection to fill those gaps and really stretch out these radar plots as much as possible. But obviously that takes a bit longer than we had in this process. But that would be our reflection for future work. We used participatory systems mapping. And actually we were lucky to have Professor Nigel Gilbert from CCAM, the Centre for Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus, I hope I've got that right, at Surrey, who developed this software. And it's an interactive software, so essentially it's the equivalent of being in the same room and being able to draw on a whiteboard a kind of systems map and put your sticky notes on the map. You can see what other notes people are putting onto that map in real time. So it's an interactive online platform for developing what we call risk cascades. So these are how risks flow through some process of causality to lead to some overall impact on health. And we can think about interventions here shown in yellow that reduce those risks. And some of those interventions may be reactive and require data monitoring scheme watch points that allow us to track how the system, whether this risk is being realized, and then we could potentially put in place those interventions. So, as we were developing this project, we considered other approaches for trying to understand and anticipate in complex systems. So these might involve things like systems dynamics models or Bayesian belief networks. In this case, you develop some kind of conceptual map or understanding of how these different elements fit together. And you parameterize this, how does this link fit to this link? You provide a best guess in terms of an estimate of your probability or your strength of interaction. And that can be done in this Bayesian belief network approach as well by using expert elicitation to estimate these probabilities. The danger is with this approach, I mean, this is taken forward in, for example, German and Belgian environment agencies. And But you end up with a whole set of emergent system properties, but they're very contingent upon how you've scored these interactions. And there's a lot of uncertainty in these probabilities. And in many cases, you know, we just don't know. There's such deep uncertainty, both in the structural element, but also in the parameter uncertainty around these links. There are other approaches, of course, for modeling complex systems, such as agent-based models, Earth system models here, or integrated assessment models that plug together an Earth system model, which, for example, modeling the processes between ocean, land surface, and climate dynamics. And then that can be plugged into a model about how crops grow and a model of how pollinators respond, etc., natural enemies, and how that provides benefits to people. You can imagine the propagation of uncertainty in these models, but also there are just many areas that we just, you know, don't understand enough to develop this quantitative framework. And this seminal systems thinker, Frederick Vester, who was important in the development of cybernetics theory, made a strong point in his book saying, you know, there's no point in modeling a system based on just what data you have and ignoring other parts of the system that are particularly important. So if you think you're trying to model how traffic flows through a city, there's no point in just using really absolute detailed data for one area of the city and ignoring the flow of traffic and key factors elsewhere or even outside the city that are going to affect the traffic. So you're better trying to build a bigger model that captures the key processes, even if they're more less well defined, and you know, even a qualitative model is better than a small, more limited quantitative model that ignores key processes. And that's also reflected in, for example, this book about sort of radical uncertainty by these two prominent economists who talk about good decisions not using quantitative information, but using qualitative information and really combining that with experience. So, you know, seeing how systems respond, think that the importance of managing adaptively and these learning processes as well. So really this is justifying the participatory systems mapping approach, which is a kind of middle ground between saying, let's build a quantitative model with the data we've got, which we know is problematic because it's not comprehensive enough, versus saying, this is all too complex, let's do nothing and just ignore these complex risks, which is arguably, you know, what society has done, even if not willfully, but we've neglected these types of risks. So really the middle ground is to try to take an approach to understanding these risks, building conceptual models that are as broad and comprehensive as possible, using a qualitative approach. So that's what we did, developing these systems maps, and we had these individual risk cascades. You can see 39 different individual risk cascades. The way we did it was we asked participants to either produce a narrative in prose, or they could produce a flowchart in the participatory systems mapping software for one element of how some kind of risk might play out. And then we combined those. There was obviously some duplication, and we got the SysRisk team also to suggest those. And we grouped those together into these 39 risk cascades. But obviously we know they interact, and there's interactions between the different types of risk cascade and how they play out. And so they're captured better in these overview maps. So really this hierarchical structure of the project is reflecting that these, it's the balance between a reductionist approach to try to understand the flow of individual risks, combined with a more holistic approach to, you know, not ignore the systemic element where these risks interact with each other. So here's just some examples of the overview maps for the different topics. This is kind of what they look like, with the factors shown here in green, the interventions in yellow, and the data watch points in blue. All these are available in the report. You'll see there's hyperlinked in the report to the 39 individual risk cascades, the overview maps, each of the narratives, all the interventions, all available hyperlinked through the report. So obviously I won't go into the details of any individual maps now. I want to make some overall reflections on our approach though. We know it's important to think about these risks in the context of changing socio-environmental systems, you know, the dynamics of these systems. For example, this is again some work from the European Environment Agency highlighting these global megatrends. And other people have done this type of work as well. This is the Ministry of Defence analysis of different sort of dynamics that we need to bear in mind when we're thinking about the future. So we asked participants to try to think about these types of drivers. But actually, in retrospect, and if we had longer, really, it's not natural always to think in this way, to try to think very comprehensively about how these different drivers might interact, both to affect the likelihood of different risks, but also to affect whether our interventions are going to be effective in light of these socio-environmental system dynamics. And really, actually, futures approaches are valuable because they help to structure that type of thinking. So, for example, using scenarios where you look at plausible future scenarios for how climate might change, geopolitical change, demographic change. And then we use those scenarios to say, well, you know, what's the likelihood of the risk under this scenario, or the likelihood of this intervention being effective under this scenario? So there are ways of structuring that thinking and helping reduce certain cognitive biases. For example, the availability bias, where we focus on things that are more salient and things that have happened more recently. So as an example, you know, in our food system studies, there was a big focus on labour shortages because they're very salient in terms of happening frequently, sorry. And perhaps a slight underplaying of other risks that are more hidden, like water shortages and other types of supply chain disruption. So really helping to stretch people's thinking away from some of these cognitive biases would be valuable. The other element I'd like to reflect on is just the deep uncertainty in these systems. You know, we've tried to take an approach here which is as comprehensive as possible, trying to, you know, get together these broad experts, maximize the cognitive diversity when trying to think about how these risks play out across different political, economic, social, technological systems, etc. But we know we're not going to be exhaustive. By definition, these risks are non-intuitive and can be unexpected. So really emphasizing the approach of also a resilience building approach, where some actions just build general resilience of a population. For example, the resilience of infrastructure, of health, etc., that help to maintain our health and livelihoods under unexpected risks as well. So a big part of the project was focusing on interventions, and so trying to understand how these different complex risks could play out, and thinking, okay, well, how can we develop interventions? Not just sort of sticking plaster fixes, waiting for the risk to happen and thinking, oh, what do we do? But actually, some of the interventions really addressing some of the deeper drivers of change related to, consumption patterns or changing climates and land use degradation, etc. For any intervention, there are a number of questions that need to be considered. I mean, we came up with several hundred interventions and data watch points. So really to kind of think about which of those we should develop further as a society. There are a number of questions about whether they're proactive or reactive, how feasible those interventions are in terms of the costs, how deliverable they are, their likely effectiveness, distributional issues like who are the losers and winners. Now, these are all the kind of bread and butter of policy decisions, I guess. But also there's some additional questions around complementarity of interventions, specific ordering needed, for example, who are the key actors, and crucially, what are the co-benefits of different interventions? That can they reduce multiple types of risk, or do they produce trade-offs? And in some cases, using systems approaches to help understand this multifunctionality is really, really valuable. So just to give you one example, really, we scored our interventions for the extent to which we thought they'd be multifunctional, both having trade-offs, although that was less frequent, but often more in terms of the co-benefits. So for example, interventions here, shown as the small circles, in the middle of this Venn diagram, can address multiple types of risk. So for example, increasing ventilation in a house or workplace improves indoor air quality from indoor air pollutants, but also improves biosecurity in terms of airborne diseases. Equally, for example, food security, campaigns that try to change people's diets and reduce the consumption of unsustainable foods and can also lead to more healthy diets, which both it can reduce land use degradation, which is a key driver of emerging zoonotic diseases, and also it can improve the general health of the population, improve their resilience to disease. So you can see some examples here of multifunctional interventions, and a big question is, you know, are we pursuing these? Because obviously interventions that kill multiple birds with the same stone are great, but you can see in some cases that these are not implemented currently. So this is still work that's ongoing, but really trying to understand, you know, whether we can develop these multifunctional interventions more and raise the profile. And one reason that they're relatively neglected may be because they fall between the different sectoral or policy silos that we have. And so they fall between the gaps, and really, you know, but they'd be very valuable to pursue. The other things we looked at were, in addition to whether interventions are proactive and reactive, and how data and monitoring watch points can be useful for informing reactive interventions. We looked at deep and shallow interventions in terms of shallow interventions work, for example, at the level of things like the flow of materials through a system or taxes, getting the prices right, whereas deeper interventions relate to the design of our institutions, and even to the level of our worldviews and our underlying mindsets. This is just building on a lot of work in systems thinking about these kind of deeper leverage points. And actually, we found that many interventions have aspects of both, can be implemented in different ways, both deep and shallow. And there's lots of examples in the report on that. And also, we looked at ways to implement multifunctional interventions where they were more vague, because sometimes the interventions that address the deeper leverage points tend to be articulated in a less precise way. They're more vague, and actually can be implemented in many different ways. So actually improving the resolution of how you might implement those types of interventions can obviously be very valuable, hopefully. And the last point really that I'm going to reflect upon here, and there's several more in the report, which I'd encourage you to have a look at, of course, is really about how we develop this capacity to appraise systemic risk. This project was just a pilot. Obviously, deciding how much you invest in institutional frameworks for analysing systemic risk is challenging. You can't run a normal cost-benefit analysis because by definition, these risks cannot be defined easily in probabilistic terms. But just by past experience, you know, showing the huge cost to a nation from COVID-19, from air pollution, from food insecurity, you know, I think it's clear that, a significantly improved investment in systemic risk appraisal would be a wise investment. We think that that's best done by national government, but that facilitation should certainly involve a wide range of actors, and that should be experts from different academic disciplines, different sectors, and for example, the food systems analysis explored a way of stratifying not just by the PESEL categories, but also by different activity systems in the food system. And so these are ways to broaden that cognitive diversity that you need to to best understand that risk in the most comprehensive way possible. But equally, you may want to bring in members of communities that are impacted by risks, especially where these are complex types of risk. So that's something else to consider as well. And really just the last point is that, as I talked about with the interventions, there's a whole process of participatory systems mapping, but there's also these systems approaches for appraising and helping to prioritize interventions in terms of understanding the trade-offs and the co-benefits. And some of this capacity and competencies are being developed in government. For example, some of us on this project were involved in Defra's systems research program as we were academic secondees to that program. That's developed into the Systems Innovations and Futures team in Defra, of which Phil Tovey, who's going to speak next, is the head of the Futures part. And equally in other government departments in the UK, for example, in Bays, they're taking a systems approach to net zero. So really this is developing, and it really can link into that systems approach in terms of building on this element of participatory systems mapping as well. So really, I'm going to hand over to Phil now for some thoughts from the government side about operationalising operationalizing some of the types of outputs of the processes that we've explored in this project. So over to you, Phil.
Thank you, Tom. Lovely to see folks and returning figures from what has been a really exciting year-long process, just shy of. So firstly, let me extend my thanks, Tom, to you and the rest of the team for having Vanessa and me so embedded within this. And it's really worth highlighting, actually, for other government colleagues and anybody else, actually, working in this way has been really valuable, because we haven't had to wait to siphon off all of the different bits of value and learning that we've extracted throughout the process in terms of when the report has been generating firmer insights as it's gone on, but also just learning more from each other as any kind of team does. So it's been an incredibly valuable process to be embedded within this project, and it's definitely something that we will look to take forward, especially kind of sat within the Chief Scientific Advisor's Office. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that we've got and some of the reflections about how we take forward what's been done in the report. We've obviously been doing this as we've been going along. And one of the key benefits of having us embedded within this has been we've been able to kind of ask those questions to try and shape the types of analysis and research that's gone into this, with a clear view of actually how would you put this into practice, and how can we take some of the recommendations that are always kind of produced with these reports and put them to work straight away. So I'll try and articulate some of our thinking around that. But as Tom said, this has been a pilot. So one of the biggest things coming out of this is, where do we actually need to improve to reach some form of operationalization with this? You mightn't be surprised. One of the biggest things that we're interested in as a future team is seeing things coming either before it's too late, so we can mitigate harm, or before, obviously, so we can seize opportunity. So the watch points for us suddenly become very, very important. And what the SysRisk report has directed us towards is not only what are the types of things that we could watch to identify key risk cascades, but also where do they sit within the system structure. So Tom mentioned deep and shallow intervention points. What you also have is deeper in terms of a temporal sense, so earlier watch points that we can use as kind of key high-level indicators of system change, right the way down. And if you move towards the area of impact on the system cascades, you can also see closer in shorter time watch points that we might have to monitor to track development. So the idea that's been really attractive through system risk, and I think it's the concept at least is one we're interested in developing more, is how can we use this to increase our foresight? So having done the prior work of mapping the system, even if we miss something at a certain point, which we likely will, can we observe what's happening in the environment, let's say within the UK food system, we observe a phenomena that's happening, and can we locate ourselves within this kind of systems diagram? And because we've already done some of the mapping through it, we know where some of the permutations might start to ripple through, and use that to get some anticipatory advantage, to then start to provide advice back to ministers and officials to say, we've already had a look at this. These are some ways in which we think it can go. And that might sound incredibly simple, but one of the things that the narrative parts that especially have done within each of the cascades is you have quite succinctly evidence that there is such a disposition within the systems that we're working in that have systemic risk. And that might sound incredibly obvious, but it's something that we can already at this stage point to and say, yes, we are aware that we do have the propensity within this system for a cascading effect to ripple out, and we need to approach it in that way when we're considering it. Because what often happens is we will inevitably get channeled onto one thing, onto the single kind of node within the system that's causing the most pain for the department or for government in general. So already SysRisk tells us and gives us some evidence and some support to say, let's not get channeled, and then break out into those kind of watch points and start the process of going, let's evaluate some of these interventions. And we could do that on a slower time, so we can start to consider those at strategic level. Or if we need to, we can start to, it's a go-to source that we have some, that buys us some preparedness. I'm deliberately hedging some of that because, again, as Tom said, and I think as we've all acknowledged on the project, there's going to be further work to develop the quality of watch points, for instance, and in the report there's a good section on that that gives some indication as to how we might do that. So overall, I think it's a wonderful report. It's got a number of different component parts. The way in which each system has been broken down with the narratives and the maps, you've got some good accessibility there. And so it's through each of the watch points, interventions, and the overall maps themselves, Vanessa and I and the rest of the Chief Scientific Advisor's Office, not least the Systems Future and Innovation team, are going to be able to kind of take these concepts forward and start to explore them more. So I'll leave it there. Tom, thank you very much. And I think we're going to go over to Sarah for some questions.
Great. Well, thanks, Phil. I'm just going to quickly show one more slide and then hand over to Sarah, just to say, really, from my side, thanks to all the participants who are listed here, also acknowledged in the report itself. That report's available. We'll be sending it to everyone on the call today, and also anyone who's listening remotely, you can find it on this this web link here. So yeah, just to thank, really, obviously we couldn't have done this without those external experts, and they've been, you know, amazing in terms of their engagement. So I'll hand over to Sarah now to field some questions, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. So we've already got some questions coming in the discussion, and actually it's really nice to see some discussion already happening about what might come next. I think the first thing that we have is a comment from Alan Hayes talking about the definition of systemic risks, saying it's very rich and can be a great jumping off point for bringing business stakeholders on board with the report. Typically, they'll be aware of conventional risks in individual areas, and contagion from other areas have already worried them. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Alan, or anything you would like responding to?
Very brief comment, which is that in one sense, now is a great time to talk the language of risk with business stakeholders, because they're all seeing it and experiencing it on a daily basis on the back of the pandemic. However, there's very little narrative within business about complex or about systemic risks. So that definition that we have here is a great way of, I think, fast tracking discussions within companies and within the business community about risk. So if we can find ways of packaging that and building it out a little bit, I think it'd be really powerful for us.
I think that's really helpful. Thanks, Alan. Did anybody from the team want to come back on that? Are you happy? Okay, in the interest of time, we'll move on. So then we had a question from Ian Lisk, who's the chair of the NHP, Natural Hazards Partnership, sorry, who asked whether Tom could confirm where the figure of 100,000 air quality related deaths in the UK came from. Tom, I don't know if you want to take that, because equally, I'm not sure where that figure came from either.
I hope I've got it right. So that figure came from, I think it's Public Health England report, but I will double check it because I don't want to get it wrong.
I mean, I think from my awareness, the numbers quoted generally are more often between 40,000 and sort of 60,000, depending on which methodology you use. But there are lots of different estimates out there because it's quite difficult to quantify. So Ian, Tom will try to clarify, but
yeah, yes. I will do, yeah.
Okay, great. Then I think we had a couple of comments about the external engagement and people externally being engaged, and how important that sort of multidisciplinary approach has been, or using people from multidisciplinary backgrounds. I wondered particularly if Eloise wanted to make a comment about her note that one issue with input from multidisciplinary expertise is that there might be real gaps in the disciplines. Did you want to raise that at all, Eloise?
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, I'm just speaking personally from my perspective. I could see that the law node was pretty low, which is me. I'm an environmental lawyer. And I think from the perspective of my discipline, legal and governance experts on very technical areas, there is a bit of a gap. So I think the reason why I've been brought in is I'm one of the few people working on air quality in the country. From a legal perspective, lots of people there are cognate disciplines with quite rich contributions, but that's something that I'm aware of. And I think that's because there's a bit of a disciplinary barrier to entry when you're dealing with topics that require interaction with technical disciplines. So that might explain some of the pestle kind of bumping around, not just that you didn't find people, but that developing that disciplinary expertise in certain areas can be more challenging than others.
Yeah, thanks, Eloise. I think that's a really good point, and something that actually within the team we sort of talked about a bit. Alan, did you want to come back? So Alan had commented that it's not easy bringing specific disciplinary expertise to bear in a systemic way, and it's not part of many day jobs. Was there anything you wanted to comment on that, Alan?
No, not at this stage. I've been chatting with Laura and Tom offline about it. That's fine.
That's great. So then we have a question here from Helen Doran at the Futures Methods Lead at Government Office for Science. Did you do any analysis of how the systemic risks you identified interact with the risks in the National Strategic Risk Register? And I think, Phil, are you all right to take that on? Yeah,
thanks, Sarah. Hi, Helen. I do want to answer. Tom, others, you might want to come in from your side. Just to say that actually, Vanessa's been heavily involved, as we have it more broadly as a team, in trying to explore systemic features of risk within the National Security and Risk Assessment. So there's work ongoing on that, but we'd be really interested to kind of have further conversations about influencing that process and to seeing how we can get, particularly within the environmental space, not least with things that Defra is concerned about, where we're not the risk, although we are the risk owners for a significant amount of the national risks. We are often at the blunt end of a lot of the other ones, if not least if you think about nuclear attack, for an example, where we've got huge impacts across all of the domains that we looked at within biosecurity and food. So taking a systemic approach is something that we're really keen to do whilst engaging in that process. And also then some of the challenges that the report highlights around taking the temporal boundaries around systems, we're also keen about looking at what happens over some of these longer time frames. And Vanessa's leading a project on global catastrophic risk, which is necessarily challenging some of those temporal dimensions as well. And when you start to do that, you get more complexity within the systemic impacts, and they should reflect in the types of interventions that we should be considering. So we'd love to pick that up with you or anyone else if they're interested, but maybe there's a few from others on the team.
I'm happy to quickly follow up on that, if that's okay. Just, I think one of the things we realized as we developed the project as well is that the data watch points, or the monitoring scheme watch points, in themselves are a key part of the process. But actually, in many cases, to understand, the resilience of a system, you need not just the sort of data, but actually a kind of model for how the system might change and lose those benefits. So kind of, especially with regards to tipping points, the danger with a tipping point is you just watch it and then you see it happen and it's too late. So actually building models of what type of data do we need to collect for early warning signals. But that's not just always about the data. There's also some underpinning model that involves that. And I think the science there really needs to go hand in hand with understanding what type of data to collect. So there's definitely an element there of models of resilience as well.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to go to things which are actually questions. If anybody's got something that's a comment that they really want to get some feedback on, then by all means repost it or jump in with sticking a hand up to say that you'd like to discuss it a bit more. So we had a question from Alan Hayes, asking, can we do another project using the benefit of all the fabulous learning from SysRisk? I guess, Tom, you might be the best person to take that on to begin with, if you're happy to do that.
I mean, it'd be great. I think there's definite avenues to go down. I think I need a little break after it's such a sort of marathon sprint towards the end. But it's been, yeah, I definitely think there's more work needed in this area, not just within academia, but also with government and businesses as well, who are also working on systemic risks, you know, insurance industries, etc. So yeah, I completely agree. But I don't know if others have got thoughts on where next is the key forward. I see Bob's got his hand up.
Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to Phil's point is really important. And it's a principle. I think it's taught us a number of different principles. I remember talking to previous chief scientist Ian Boyd, who said that there needs to be much more closer working between academia and policy. And I think this is a good exemplar of that. And we haven't probably put that in the report. We could strengthen that, I think, is that this is a good example of what should happen in future funding. Because it has been an equal partnership, and as the boundary has been blurred between policy and academia, and I think that's a lesson for it's much a richer relationship and partnership, I think. So any future funding will take that principle forward, I feel.
And it was nice to see there's already a bit of discussion about how people can work together on things that are already happening. So it would be great to follow up on some of those conversations. Then the next question that we had was from Helen Doran, again from the Government Office for Science. How did you deal with acute and chronic risks, i.e. event-based hazards versus tipping points disruption for longer term change? I don't know who wants to pick that up from the team.
I don't mind having a stab, and people can jump in. So I think it's probably fair to say that the temporal aspect of which chronicness and acute, primarily I interpret them as, so they're temporal distinctions, was actually really difficult. You know, time features in really complex ways. So you've got interactions between. So you've got causal interactions between events. So you've got different temporal scales between each one of the nodes, but then you have kind of temporal causal relationships. So one might happen slow, the other might happen fast, and that's just within a node, two nodes within the system. So you've got so many complex things going on there. I think the biggest thing that the SysRisk project has done is kind of given you some landscaping to then ask those questions. So rather than it returning an answer, it says, actually, if one of these things accelerates, what's the type of impacts that we might see happen with the others? So, or equally, can I accelerate the process or decelerate a process here through intervention? And if there's an acute event that happens within this point in the system, what are the different reverberations that happen because of that? So I think it's much more, I think the thing for us to come away with is that you can view this through a temporal lens and you can get further insights from it rather than the actual work itself delivering you a very clear kind of response. But others might want to come in on that.
I'm aware we're rapidly running out of time. So Tom, we've got a couple more questions in the chat. Are you happy for us to quickly try and cover them, or do you want to deal with them afterwards? We're already at 29 minutes past 11.
Well, I'd say let's anyone who needs to drop off because it is 11:30 is fine. And then if the people who ask those questions, we're happy to stay for another five minutes or so, of course. So yeah, let's have those questions. But understandable, people might need to drop off now. And thanks, just to say thanks for joining, and happy to follow up in whatever way.
Yeah, and just to say, obviously, that the final report will be sent out later today, as Tom said, and shared on the website. And do contact us if there's anything that you want to follow up on. Okay, so if we go back to the questions, then we've got one from Eloise, which was asking, does the report cover how specific risk cascades were narrowed down in the process? And she was asking whether it was covered in full by the report.
Should I tell you why I was asking this very briefly?
Yeah, go on, Eloise.
And mainly because I can't remember which workshop it was, maybe the third one when we really narrowed down. I mean, I think it was done on a quantitative basis. I can't exactly remember, but I was surprised at where we ended up on the air quality stream. And I felt like there was so much richness in the cascades that we'd done early on that whether they were, it might be answered by it being a pilot, but I just felt like there was a lot of material that we could have kept pursuing and looking at. And there's I don't know, lots of potential for work right there. But I was surprised where we ended up with the cascades that we worked on.
Tom, you want to?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to expand on that a little bit. Yeah, I mean, it would be great to have more time. It was a year-long project. Just to answer your question directly, we had a process. We had all the, I mentioned 39 different risk cascades, and we had to narrow down and focus on a small subset. So each case study then focused on 4, and we asked participants to score the narratives or the risk cascades by their impact and likelihood. And we use that to help us zoom in on risk cascades that we felt were most, highest impact and highest likelihood. And so that's allowed us to zoom in there. And then at the last workshop was about this kind of deep dive into multifunctional interventions. And that, I agree, was quite narrow, because it was really exploring kind of piloting approach by which you might take an overarching, quite vague intervention and really break it down and understand how you would implement it in different ways, how you would implement it, who are the key actors, what are the barriers, enablers, etc. And I think the point is well taken, that we have to expand that substantially if we wanted to. It'd be nice to be much more comprehensive and not have to just take it as a sort of very limited pilot. But that was the process, and it's all documented in the report. Yeah.
I remembered that. I just wondered whether the limitations are going to be acknowledged.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a pilot process, and I mean, the whole project, if you think about it, focusing on environmental risk, even though the risk cascade through these different political, economic systems, etc., we're focusing on risks that have to have an environmental factor. But there are many systemic risks that are non-environmental, and then but can affect health and livelihoods. So by definition, the project is already narrowed, and then we've narrowed it down at every stage. So really, it is a pilot, and yeah, we do reflect on that will never be comprehensive in this report.
Yeah, brilliant. That's really helpful. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, and then we've got, is it Emma O'Connell? I'm sorry if I've not said that right.
That's okay, Sarah. It's Emer. Hi, I'm with UKHSA and I work in public health. So we do deal with systemic risks, and with health as the shared outcome, often we're looking across the system for the various drivers. I'm really interested to hear what you did, because one of the challenges we have is around when we can identify upstream interventions, making the case for the money to be spent on that intervention, which is often to be spent by another government department, and where hypothetically the NHS is the end output, but sometimes it's not even the NHS, it might just be overall health benefit. So do you think that your framework might be helpful in making the case for that policy moment where you're saying, well, actually, this is a societal benefit? And I guess my question is around those quantified uncertainties and financial benefit conversations and how they're framed within that.
Anyone else want to have a go? Because I'm happy to, but I'm equally, there are many others who can speak to this. No? Okay, I will do then.
Sorry, tricky
I'll hand over
question.
to Bob. I just say I completely agree, and there are many schemes like green social prescribing, etc., that really build the barriers between health and environmental protection, etc. And I think, yeah, one of the issues is the siloed nature of our policy systems and our sectors, etc. And this project hopefully helps to overcome that. But there are many other approaches in government and that can do that. And I think that is a big step, regardless of the cost-benefit analysis. Just actually getting different people from different departments together, talking about these different solutions. I think we touched on that in the multifunctionality part, and that was really one of our motivations for that, is because we know that there is that sometimes a lack of discourse just even having those initial conversations, let alone getting down and doing the cost benefit analysis of those figures. But in many cases, they are very lead to good benefits with quite reasonable costs, I think. But Bob, you wanted to come back. So.
Yeah, it's a great point, Ema, because I think food security case was it's a good example of that, because the participants didn't only identify environmental risks, they identified trade risks, they identified labour risks, health risks, and that of course involves lots of different government departments, Department for International Trade, DWP, etc. So we completely agree that it needs more joined up. It's illustrated we need more joined up kind of governance and mechanisms across, even though there are some existing, across government departments to talk about these issues.
Phil.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll just say quickly from a government side, I absolutely recognise what you're saying there. I think at a very minimum, what you've got in the SysRisk report is at least something that you can say, look, here is a cascade. Here's a number of risk cascades that shows that actually upstream intervention is probably at least worth very seriously considering. The problem, of course, is the complexity. As kind of Tom said, the cost benefit analysis is incredibly difficult, if not, frankly, kind of a bit futile to do. Yeah. So what I feel like we have a little bit more now with some development is at least something we can point to go, look, I can narrate this risk cascade for you. And it should just help us along that journey of brokering some decisions within the complexity. So I'm quite hopeful for that, and it'd be interesting to kind of maybe catch up and discuss how we could do that.
Yeah, I wonder whether now is a moment, whereas we would have been saying for quite some time that there were some vulnerabilities in the system, that if a pandemic came, we would be looking at systemic lack of resilience, and there may be an open-mindedness that is there now that wasn't there before.
Absolutely.
I also think one of the things that's important from that is about the breadth of people involved, because while we focused on air pollution, it meant that for the interventions that we were looking at and scoring, although we scored them across our three case studies, had we scored them across sort of all sorts of different risks, there might have been far more that were multifunctional, but we only had the participants, the people that we had in the project. And so actually, if you were doing this, if you like, in anger about a specific area, that's something that I would really think is really important, is to try and get that broader perspective on, which I don't think we very often do. And there's some thinking starting about it in parts of Defra about how do we improve the narratives around, we want to do this for this reason, but it's delivering all these different things across many different areas, and how can we deliver it in a way that maximizes those and minimizes any trade-offs. And I think that's a really important space for the kind of thing that you're talking about.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we've had some really good discussion, and there's loads of other things I'd like to pick up in the chat, but we don't have time to. I'd just like to say thank you so much for your time, and thanks for those of you that have hung around right until the end. And I hope that you will be in contact and follow up. I think Andre's dropped in the chat that if people want to follow up for the moment, the only thing we can offer is our email address, the SysRisk email address. But I know that Ray was asking about whether there was anywhere else that people could be having a conversation about this, and perhaps that's something we can try and pick up. So yes, thanks for your time, and yeah, that's the end of the meeting. Thanks all.
Thanks for joining. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for chairing, Sarah.
Great job.